It was supposed to be a simple school outing. 11 children and 2 teachers walking into an old brick schoolhouse in 1987. They never walked back out, and for 19 years, their families were left with nothing but silence. But when demolition crews broke open the basement, they uncovered a secret so dark it shattered an entire town. The photograph was the kind you find tucked in an old shoebox. 11 smiling faces, the sun at their backs, uniforms neat but a little rumpled, 2 teachers standing behind them with proud but tired smiles. The date scrawled on the back in blue ink read, Spring 1987, Class Outing. For years, the photo would be the only thing parents had left to hold on to. The children were all from St. Mary's Primary, a small parochial school on the edge of a fading mill town in southern Ohio. In the photo, their neckties were crooked, shoes dusty from the playground, but they looked like the kind of children who would grow up into ordinary lives. Ball games in the street, piano lessons in the evening, Sunday dinners with grandparents. There were 9 of them. Michael Collins, 10, who had a knack for drawing cars in the margins of his notebooks. Peter Walsh, tall for his age, a little shy, who never went anywhere without his baseball cap. Jacob and Emily Reed, twins with matching auburn hair and mismatched personalities. Jacob mischievous, Emily soft-spoken. Anna Porter, red braids and freckles, who always carried a library book tucked under her arm. Brian Harris, small, anxious, but known for reciting facts about planets that made adults laugh. Laura Miller, 11, serious-eyed, whose father worked in the paper mill. Samuel Briggs, the joker of the group, who whistled through his teeth whenever teachers turned their backs. And Catherine Kate Lawson, 9, the youngest, whose mother made her a blue plaid dress by hand that spring. Behind them in the picture stood their teachers, Miss Ruth Ellison, mid-30s, kind, with a calm presence that steadied parents, as much as students, and Mrs. Dorothy Carr, older, nearing retirement, known for her strictness but also for baking cookies for class parties. On the morning of May 14, 1987, St. Mary's arranged a special outing. The children were to walk together with their teachers to the old Riverside Schoolhouse, an abandoned brick building less than a mile away, once the town's main school before it shuttered in the 1960s. The plan was to tour the ruins as part of a local history lesson. Parents were uneasy. Why send kids into that crumbling place? But assurances had been given. The school had cleared it. The basement was locked. The building deemed safe for a short supervised visit. The children never came back. At first, no one panicked. It was a sunny day. The walk should have taken 10 minutes. Perhaps they lingered at the playground or stopped by the river. By 3 o'clock, though, when parents arrived for pickup and no group returned, unease turned to fear. By 4, the sheriff's department was alerted. By dusk, the town of Mill Creek had erupted into chaos. The 2 teachers' cars were found still parked at St. Mary's. The chalkboard inside had History Lesson Riverside, written in neat block letters. The trail toward the old schoolhouse was obvious. Neighbors recalled seeing the children laughing and skipping along the sidewalk, Miss Ellison herding them forward, Mrs. Carr bringing up the rear. By nightfall, deputies and volunteers swarmed the grounds of the Riverside Schoolhouse. The building looked as it had for decades, red brick crumbling, windows knocked out, weeds curling through the cracks. The heavy wooden front door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, dust and broken desks, but no children, no teachers, flashlights. Swept the classrooms, the stairwell, the attic, nothing. The basement door was chained shut with a rusted lock. Deputies forced it open. The air that rushed out smelled of mold and old paper. The steps led into darkness, cement walls lined with shelves. Searchers scoured every inch, their voices echoing, empty. By midnight, the town buzzed with confusion. 11 people don't vanish in a span of an hour. There had to be tracks, signs, something. Dogs were brought in. They picked up a scent to the schoolhouse and then lost it near the old gymnasium. It was as if the children and teachers had walked inside and dissolved. For weeks, Mill Creek was a town under siege by its own grief. Helicopters combed the fields. The river was dragged. Neighbors opened barns, sheds, attics. Reporters arrived, setting up satellite vans along Main Street, pressing microphones at weeping parents. Theories sprouted fast. Had the children run away? Impossible. 9 children and 2 teachers couldn't coordinate something so flawless. Kidnapping? Who could move 11 people without a trace in broad daylight? Some whispered about the basement, about tunnels said to connect Riverside to the mill. Others muttered about something darker, that the school itself was cursed, that it had swallowed them whole. The official investigation hit wall after wall. No fingerprints beyond the obvious. No footprints outside the school larger than the poor children's. The sheriff called in the FBI. Agents poured through attendance records, family histories, and the crumbling building itself. They drilled in the basement floor, searching for hidden space. Nothing. Summer came, but for Mill Creek, time stalled on that May afternoon. Parents kept children indoors. St. Mary's enrollment collapsed. The mill, already struggling, began layoffs as rumors spread that the town itself was unsafe. The Reed twins' father died 2 years later of a heart attack. Neighbors said grief had carved him hollow. Kate Lawson's mother moved away, unable to walk past the empty swing set. Miss Ellison's younger brother enlisted in the army, telling friends he couldn't stay where people stared as if waiting for his sister to come home. By 1989, the case was declared cold. 11 names went onto a plaque in the county courthouse. Every year the families held vigils. Every year, reporters came back, wrote a few lines, and left. The Riverside schoolhouse sagged deeper into ruin, the weeds climbing higher, its broken windows staring blankly over the town that refused to forget. No one knew then that the truth sat only feet beneath their shoes. 19 years later, in 2006, the Riverside schoolhouse was slated for demolition. The mill had closed, for good, and the town council planned to raze the building and sell the lot. Workers arrived with machinery, hauling bricks into dumpsters, tearing down classrooms where laughter had once echoed. By the 3rd day they reached the basement. A backhoe tore into the cement wall. Behind it was a hollow space no one had ever seen on the maps. As dust settled, a foreman's light swept across rusted pipes, discarded desks, and something else. Children's shoes, dozens of them, scattered on the floor. The workers stopped cold. Police were called. Soon, the sheriff's trucks returned to the Riverside schoolhouse for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Crime tape went up. Reporters descended. Families rushed to the site, hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. For the first time since 1987, the town of Mill Creek felt closer to answers than silence, but no one yet understood what the basement would reveal, or how terrible the truth would be once the walls were broken open. The first 48 hours of the investigation into the missing children and teachers from St. Mary's were a blur of desperation. Sheriff Harold Minton, who had been in office less than 2 years, found himself standing at the front steps of the Riverside schoolhouse at dawn on May 15, 1987, staring at the boarded windows as if they might blink back answers. His deputies were exhausted, dogs whining from fatigue, but the parents gathered outside pressed him for something, anything. The FBI had been called by then. Agents arrived in sedans with federal plates carrying briefcases and tape recorders. They took statements in kitchens, in parish halls, at the mill's break room where fathers slumped still in work boots, faces streaked with grime and fear. One detail came up again and again. The group had been seen entering Riverside shortly before noon. 2 postal workers had waved to Miss Ellison as she shepherded the children across the street. A pair of teenagers playing basketball near the river swore they'd heard kids' laughter echo from inside the schoolhouse. No one saw them leave. Deputies found scuff marks on the cement near the basement door, as if the group had shuffled impatiently while waiting for it to open. The chain on the door was old, the padlock rusted, but when cut open the night before, the basement had been empty. FBI techs sprayed luminol on the cement, swept ultraviolet lights across walls, but no blood, no drag marks. It was a basement, like any other, mold, dust, cobwebs, and yet 11 people had gone missing inside. Theories spread quickly, fanned by reporters who camped outside town hall. Some insisted the group must have left through a back exit no one knew about. Others whispered about tunnels dug during Prohibition that allegedly linked the schoolhouse to the river. An older mill worker told deputies he remembered a boiler room with doors that led further down, but when the search team broke through the bricked-off wall, they found only collapsed pipes and rubble. By the third day, search efforts extended 20 miles outward. Helicopters circled fields. Volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder through forests. Divers searched the river even though no footprints led that way. Every barn and silo was opened. Reporters described the scene as a town turned inside out. The parents, faces haggard from lack of sleep, watched every update with a mixture of rage and hope. Mrs. Collins, Michael's mother, screamed at the sheriff during a press briefing. "They don't just disappear. They're children. Somebody took them." Her husband pulled her back, his own face gray. Investigators questioned everyone near the scene. A groundskeeper admitted he sometimes slept in the abandoned school but hadn't been there in weeks. A drifter was arrested after being spotted near the railroad yard with a backpack full of children's candy. Turned out he had bought it from the general store and no other evidence linked him to the case. Each lead burned out. Each suspicion collapsed. By the end of the first week, the town began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Some parents accused the teachers, whispers that perhaps Miss Ellison had led them away deliberately, or that Mrs. Carr had snapped. Others muttered about cults, kidnappings, conspiracies. In the grocery line, in church pews, in bar rooms, everyone had an answer, and none of them were right. The FBI set up a command post in the parish rectory. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking every reported sighting, every rumor. One pin stuck out. A truck driver claimed to have seen a yellow school bus heading north around noon on May 14th. But St. Mary's hadn't hired a bus that day. The driver couldn't recall the plate, only that the bus looked old, maybe decommissioned. Agents scoured records but found nothing. The lead went nowhere. Inside the schoolhouse, every floorboard was pried up, every wall tapped. Still nothing. No hidden rooms, no tunnels, no sign 11 people had walked beyond the point of sighting. The building seemed to mock them with its silence. Meanwhile, the parents lived in a state between waking and nightmare. The Reed family left their porch light on every night, as if Emily and Jacob might walk up the steps. Samuel Briggs's father quit his job at the mill, spending days pacing the riverbank, staring at the water as if it might give up secrets. Anna Porter's mother stopped speaking altogether, sitting in her kitchen staring at the clock as hours bled into days. By mid-June, the national media had moved on, leaving Mill Creek to its own grief. The FBI quietly scaled down operations. Sheriff Minton held fewer press briefings. Deputies drove the same roads out of habit, not hope. The case file thickened with false starts and dead ends. Still, there were moments, strange, chilling ones, that kept the town from letting go. One night, a watchman at the mill claimed he saw lights flicker in the windows of Riverside long after it had been locked by investigators. Deputies checked, found no one. A week later, children playing near the lot swore they heard muffled voices from inside. The sheriff dismissed it as imagination, but whispers spread. That Riverside wasn't just abandoned, that it was holding something back. Parents clung to any sign. They gathered outside the school at dusk, praying, calling their children's names into the wind. Sometimes faint echoes returned, just acoustics, the FBI said. But to the families it was proof the school itself was answering. By autumn, Mill Creek was a ghost of itself. St. Mary's enrollment dropped by half. Shops along Main Street closed early. Riverside, once just a ruin, became a symbol of fear. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Adults quickened their pace when its broken windows came into view. The case officially went cold in December 1987. The file was closed without ceremony, 11 names marked unresolved. The sheriff aged 10 years and 1. The FBI reassigned. Families were told to try to heal. But in Mill Creek, no one healed. The town remained stuck on May 14th, a wound unstitched, festering beneath every conversation, every silence. And Riverside stood, brick crumbling, weeds curling, windows gaping like eyes that had seen and chosen not to speak. 19 years later, when demolition crews tore into its basement and found the hidden chamber, the sheriff's old notes and the FBI's dismissals suddenly looked like cruel jokes. The truth had been under their feet the entire time, but what it contained would prove more horrifying than any parent, any investigator had ever allowed themselves to imagine. Grief doesn't fade in straight lines. In Mill Creek, it spread like water through wood, seeping into every board, every conversation, until the whole town felt swollen with it. By the time the calendar turned into 1988, life on the surface went on. Kids still played baseball in the street, the mill whistle still blew at dawn, but underneath nothing was normal. Every household carried the weight of absence. 11 empty chairs, 11 beds neatly made but never slept in, 11 names that lived on every parent's lips like prayers spoken into silence. For a while, the town tried to keep up rituals. On the 1-year anniversary, families and neighbors lit candles outside St. Mary's, the little school that now seemed too big for its dwindling enrollment. The choir sang hymns. Reporters came again, snapping pictures of parents holding framed photos. But when the cameras left, the rawness stayed. People began avoiding the gatherings, not out of disrespect, but because the pain was unbearable, the hope too thin. The Riverside schoolhouse loomed over all of it. Once just a derelict ruin at the edge of town, it became something else after. 1987. A scar, a reminder, a threat. Windows shattered further under rocks thrown by teenagers. Graffiti bloomed across the walls. "Where are they?" scrawled in dripping red paint. For the children who grew up after, Riverside was a dare. You'd hear them whisper. Spend 5 minutes inside and you'll hear voices. They said if you went into the basement and called the missing by name, the walls would whisper them back. Some swore they had. Parents hated the stories, but couldn't stop them. Rumor was oxygen in the absence of truth. By the early 1990s, Riverside wasn't just a ruin. It was legend. The families fractured under the weight. Some stayed in Mill Creek, clinging to the routines that kept their children's memories close. Others left, unable to bear the sight of the school or the pity in neighbors' eyes. Catherine Kate Lawson's mother moved 3 states away, remarrying quietly, but never changing the photograph of Kate she kept on her nightstand. The Reed twins' surviving grandparents moved into assisted living, their house left empty until the roof caved. Couples that had once hosted barbecues together now barely spoke. The shared loss that should have bonded them only deepened differences in how they grieved. Michael Collins's parents believed the children had been abducted by strangers, clinging to the idea of rescue. Laura Miller's father became convinced someone in town knew more than they admitted. He spent years keeping spiral notebooks full of names and theories, mapping connections between mill workers, delivery drivers, anyone who might have been near Riverside that day. By 1993, his notebooks filled a closet. His wife stopped sleeping in the same bed. Sheriff Harold Minton served out his term, his hair turning white in just 4 years. By 1991, he retired to Florida. His successor, Sheriff Daniel Rowe, inherited the cold file and a town that still demanded answers but had stopped expecting them. He kept the case open on paper, but there was nothing to investigate. The FBI had long since moved on. The boxes of reports sat in the courthouse basement gathering dust. Every so often, something stirred the wound. In 1994, a hunter claimed he saw children's clothing in the woods 5 miles south of town. Deputies searched, found nothing. In 1997, a rumor spread that a man arrested 2 counties over for kidnapping had confessed to taking the Mill Creek children. It wasn't true. He had never even been in the area. In 2001, a demolition crew repairing a culvert unearthed bones. They turned out to be deer remains, but for a week, Mill Creek held its breath as if the mystery might finally crack open. The town shrank. The mill cut jobs until it closed entirely in 2004. Shops along Main Street shuttered, one after another. Houses stood empty, grass high. The few who stayed learned to live with the silence, but Riverside stood, stubborn and crumbling, weeds clutching its brick walls. It was more than a building. It was the wound itself, looming over every drive. To the grocery store, every walk along the riverbank. Teenagers continued to test its myths. They dared each other to sneak inside at night, to leave initials on the blackboard, to walk into the basement and count how long they could last before fear drove them out. Some returned pale, swearing they heard footsteps behind them. Others laughed it off, but refused to go a second time. The sheriff dismissed it as local lore, but parents remembered the screams in 1987 and shivered when their kids mentioned Riverside at all. By 2006, nearly 2 decades had passed. Most of the missing children would have been in their late 20s. Some parents imagined weddings, grandchildren, lives that might have been. Others refused to imagine at all, living as if the children were frozen in time, forever 9 or 10 years old, smiling in the photo taken just before they walked toward the schoolhouse. It was in that year, after endless debates, that the town council voted to demolish Riverside. The mill land was to be parceled for sale, and the ruin was considered both a safety hazard and a curse. Few protested. The families, after 19 years, did not want the building preserved as a shrine. They wanted it gone. Perhaps, they thought, the town might breathe again without its shadow. But on the 3rd day of demolition, the truth began to surface. Workers tearing into the foundation discovered something strange, a section of basement wall that didn't match the rest. Behind layers of brick and cement was a hollow cavity. When a backhoe tore through, the operator shouted for everyone to stop. Inside, the first flashlight beams caught a scatter of objects on the dirt floor. Small leather shoes cracked with age. The sheriff's office cordoned off the site immediately. Families rushed to the lot, pressing against the yellow tape, their faces pale with dread. For 19 years they had waited. Now something was surfacing, but the shoes were only the beginning. Behind that false wall stretched a chamber no blueprint had ever shown. Dust swirled as workers backed out, shaken. Deputies shone lights in and saw desks stacked against one wall, old blackboards propped upright, and in the far corner something worse, something that made one deputy run outside to vomit. There were signs the place had once been lived in, and abandoned in a hurry. What exactly the chamber contained would take days to sort, but even in those first moments, as parents clutched one another and reporters snapped photos, everyone in Mill Creek understood. The missing had not been taken. Far. The schoolhouse had held its secret all along. When demolition stopped, silence fell over Mill Creek. The lot around Riverside filled not with machines, but with deputies, FBI vans, and a press cordon held 20 yards back. The town had waited 19 years for answers. Now every breath felt suspended, waiting for what the basement would say. The false wall was widened under floodlights. Investigators in white suits slipped through, cameras strapped to their helmets. For the first time since May 14, 1987, human voices echoed inside a chamber no one had admitted existed. What they found was worse than rumor had ever imagined. The space was larger than anyone expected, 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, built with poured concrete, its ceiling braced by steel beams. Dust coated everything, and spiderwebs hung like lace. The smell was suffocating. Mold, rust, and something faintly chemical. Scattered across the dirt floor were shoes, small leather ones with buckles, canvas sneakers with frayed laces, a pair of scuffed black school shoes tied neatly together. Investigators tagged and bagged each, laying them out in rows that looked like silent roll call. Along the walls stood desks stacked like barricades, old wooden ones with carvings etched into the surface, initials, crude hearts, half-finished. Doodles. One investigator leaned closer and found something more chilling. Scratched deep into the wood of one desk were 3 words, "We were here." The chamber showed signs of hasty occupation. In the corner, a pile of blankets, mildewed and stiff, with time. Rusted tins that had once held food. A cracked glass milk bottle, long evaporated dry. On the floor lay a child's notebook, its pages warped from damp but still legible. The cover bore a name written in block letters, Anna Porter. The first page was smudged but readable. "We are still in here. Mrs. Carr says we will go home soon. Miss Ellison tells us to pray. Some of the boys are scared. Jacob says he heard the door lock again." I think we should sing so no one cries." The writing trailed off into shaky letters, then stopped. The rest of the notebook was empty. When word reached the families, grief and fury collided. Anna's mother collapsed at the sight, clutching the fence, sobbing into her hands. Michael Collins's father shouted at deputies, "You told us you searched this place. You told us it was empty." Sheriff Rowe had no answer. The records from 1987 had insisted the basement had been cleared, and yet here were objects so personal, so undeniable, that no one could explain them away. The discovery sparked questions sharper than grief. Who had built the hidden chamber? Why had investigators never found it? How had 11 people simply vanished into a space beneath their feet while law enforcement stood above? The FBI moved quickly, sealing the chamber as a crime scene. Teams with ground-penetrating radar scanned for further hollows. They found 2 more. One was collapsed, filled with rubble. The other, smaller, lay beneath the main chamber, its entrance sealed by welded steel. By then, the families were demanding transparency. They crowded the town hall where agents tried to explain protocol. "We are proceeding carefully," the lead agent said, voice tight. "We cannot compromise evidence." But to the parents who had waited 19 years, those words sounded too much like 1987 all over again. Delay, excuses, silence. Within days, rumors spread like wildfire. Teenagers swore they had snuck to the fence line and heard tapping from underground. A retired mill worker told reporters he remembered trucks unloading at Riverside in the late 1960s, long before it closed. Others whispered about a man, long, dead now, who had worked as a janitor and never left that place. Investigators ignored the rumors, but they couldn't ignore the evidence piling up inside the chamber. DNA swabs from the shoes confirmed links to several of the missing children. Fibers from the blankets matched uniforms from St. Mary's, and tucked behind the blackboards propped in the corner, a set of Polaroid photographs was found. Most were too degraded to see clearly, but one, grainy, warped by moisture, showed a group of children huddled against a wall, their faces pale, eyes wide. At the edge of the frame, a woman stood, her profile half lit. It looked like Miss Ellison, her arms stretched protectively across the children. The families saw the photograph at a private briefing. The room erupted, sobs, gasps, shouted questions. Anna's mother fainted. Samuel Briggs's father punched the table, demanding to know why this had been hidden for so long. But it hadn't been hidden. It had been buried, entombed under Riverside, waiting to surface only now. As news of the Polaroid broke, national attention surged back to Mill Creek. Trucks from major networks lined Main Street. Commentators speculated about secret rooms, about captors who might have used the school for years, about why no one in 1987 had looked harder. Theories split in 2 directions. One suggested the children and teachers had been herded into the chamber deliberately by someone who knew Riverside's hidden architecture. The other suggested they had stumbled upon the chamber themselves, seeking shelter or playing, and been sealed in by accident. But the Polaroid cast doubt on accident. Someone had taken that photo, someone alive and present. The welded steel door below the chamber loomed large in everyone's mind. What lay behind it? The FBI promised to bring in cutting torches to proceed, methodically. But the families were running out of patience. One night, Michael Collins's father was caught trying to cut through the chain himself with borrowed bolt cutters. Deputies stopped him before he got far. His only words were, "I need to know if my boy's in there." The chamber became a pilgrimage site. People left flowers at the fence line, stuffed animals, handwritten notes. Reporters captured the images, faded teddy bears lying against crime scene tape, candles burning through the night. Mill Creek, long hollowed by silence, throbbed with grief again, raw and fresh. When the torches finally cut through the steel door a week later, investigators lowered cameras before entering. What they saw deepened the horror. The smaller chamber below was lined with shelves. On them sat glass jars, rusted cans, and waterlogged notebooks. Scattered across the floor were more personal items: hair ribbons, broken pencils, a half-deflated soccer ball, and against the far wall a crude wooden bench with rope coiled beside it. The discovery was not just evidence of captivity. It was evidence of control. Naomi Porter, Anna's aunt, spoke for many when she told reporters, "This wasn't an accident. They didn't wander down there and lose their way. Somebody put them in there." The FBI confirmed what parents already believed. The chamber had been built deliberately, its steel door welded shut from the outside. Whoever constructed it had intended it to keep people in. But who and why remained unanswered. Forensic teams combed every surface. They found fingerprints, degraded but human, on the jars and cans. They found strands of hair not matching any of the children. And in one of the notebooks, in shaky adult handwriting, they found a line that chilled every reader. "They will stay until it is safe again." Safe from what? Safe for whom? The questions piled faster than answers. But one thing was certain. The Riverside schoolhouse had not been just a ruin. It had been a prison, and whatever had happened in those chambers beneath, the truth was darker than anyone in Mill Creek had imagined. The night the second chamber was opened, Mill Creek barely slept. Reporters filed live updates from the edge of the floodlights. Parents huddled together in motel lobbies, unable to go home. Even those who had moved away years before phoned relatives, their voices trembling. What did they find? The answer dripped out slowly through press briefings crafted with caution. Investigators admitted the chamber was not accidental. It was constructed to detain. The shelves, the jars, the rope, all evidence of planning. The adult handwriting, the Polaroid photograph. It meant presence. And presence meant someone alive in 1987 had known, had watched, had locked 11 people in the dark and walked away. The news fractured the town all over again. Some whispered about outsiders, a drifter who must have slipped in unnoticed. Others pointed inward. Somebody local did this, somebody who knew Riverside better than anyone. The FBI began digging into the school's history. Riverside had closed in 1969, but its basement had been used for storage for years after. Contracts showed janitorial staff came in weekly through the early 70s. One name surfaced repeatedly: Thomas Heller, the head custodian until 1971. He had lived a mile from the schoolhouse, known as solitary, quiet. He died in 1982, 5 years before the disappearance. But Heller's personnel file contained notes about unauthorized modifications he made in the building, walls he knocked down, doors he bricked up. The blueprints never matched his alterations. Deputies remembered him even decades later, a man who never looked you in the eye, who kept every tool locked in his shed. If anyone knew every corner of that basement, it was Heller, one said. The theory formed quickly. Perhaps Heller built the chambers before his death. But if he had died 5 years before the vanishings, who had used them in 1987? The town turned its gaze toward his son. Mark Heller, then 25, had lived with his father until the elder's death. Quiet, withdrawn, he had worked odd jobs, mostly carpentry, then left Mill Creek in 1988. His name had never come up in the original investigation, not once. But now, in hindsight, the omission felt like a chasm. FBI agents tracked Mark to Kentucky, where he worked as a handyman. When questioned, he denied everything. He claimed he hadn't been near Riverside in years, hadn't known anything about chambers. But when pressed about 1987, he stumbled. He said he couldn't remember where he'd been that spring. Families latched onto his name. "Find out what he knows," Laura Miller's father shouted outside the courthouse. "That boy grew up in that building. He knows what happened to ours." At the same time, investigators analyzed the Polaroid. The children's faces were blurry, but Miss Ellison's outline was clearer. Experts concluded it was genuine, dated to the late 1980s. Fingerprints on the photo's back were too degraded to trace, but on one corner was a faint smudge of ink, the kind used in industrial markers. Analysis suggested the ink formula hadn't been common since the early 70s, raising questions about where the photo stock had been stored. The adult note found in the chamber deepened the mystery. They will stay until it is safe again. Safe from what? Some speculated Heller had been obsessed with civil defense drills, the Cold War paranoia of his era. Maybe he built the chambers as bunkers, then used them, or left them to his son, to contain the children. Others believed the note hinted at something broader, an attempt to hide the group until some danger passed. But what danger? In Mill Creek, the rumor mill spun faster than fact. A retired teacher claimed she'd seen Mark Heller near St. Mary's weeks before. The disappearance, though no one else could confirm. An old mill worker swore the Hellers had once received deliveries at Riverside after the school closed. Someone remembered seeing Thomas Heller digging trenches behind the gym, though no records existed. The FBI tried to tamp down speculation, but the pressure was impossible to contain. The families formed a coalition, hiring their own investigators. They demanded access to every file, every blueprint, every old statement. For them, patience had expired with the first shoe pulled from the dirt. Meanwhile, the forensic lab reported new results. The hair found in the second chamber did not match any of the missing children or teachers. It belonged to an adult male, likely Caucasian. A partial profile was extracted. It wasn't strong enough for CODIS, but it narrowed possibilities. To the families, it was another sign. There had been a captor. What haunted Mill Creek most was the question of time. The Polaroid proved the children had been alive after entering the basement. But for how long? Days? Weeks? Longer? Had they died there, abandoned, or been moved elsewhere when searches pressed too close? Anna Porter's notebook, with its plea to sing songs so no one would cry, suggested at least hours, maybe days, of life inside. A blanket tested positive for starch residues consistent with potatoes, evidence they had eaten something. One cracked jar contained traces of water. It meant survival, at least briefly. But if they had lived for days underground, why hadn't cries been heard? Why hadn't anyone seen movement? Unless the walls were thicker than investigators realized, unless someone had ensured their voices would never carry. In September 2006, the FBI announced they were officially reclassifying the case from missing persons to kidnapping and homicide. For the first time, it was acknowledged as a crime. Families broke down in the courthouse, clutching each other's hands. For years, they had been told it was mystery, tragedy, accident. Now the word homicide sat on official documents. Mark Heller became the focus of suspicion. He was questioned again, his alibi scrutinized. Neighbors from 1987 recalled him working construction, often alone, often disappearing for days. One remembered him showing up with scratches on his arms, muttering about repairs. None of it was enough to charge him. But in the absence of other names, his shadow grew larger by the day. Yet something gnawed at Sheriff Rowe. If Mark had orchestrated this, why no ransom? Why no attempt at leverage? The crime carried none of the fingerprints of gain. It reeked instead of obsession, control, secrecy, the kind of darkness that grows in silence, passed from father to son, sealed behind walls where no one else looks. By winter, as snow fell over the demolished lot, the families stood again at Riverside's edge. Where once stood a schoolhouse, now only rubble and a chain-link fence remained. But beneath, in the chambers, evidence still waited. Teams were cataloging every scrap. Each week, new items surfaced. A button, a broken crayon, another fragment of a notebook. And in one damp corner of the second chamber, investigators found something that sent a fresh shock through the town. Scratched into the cement wall, faint, but unmistakable, were letters drawn by desperate hands. "Help us. 516. The date was 2 days after the group vanished. The families wept when told. It meant their children had been alive at least that long. It meant they had begged for rescue, while deputies and FBI agents searched just feet above. It meant failure. Not abstract, but cruelly specific. Mill Creek reeled again. Reporters hammered officials with questions. How had this been missed? How could 11 people scratch messages into walls while search teams walked overhead? Who welded the steel door shut and why? There were no answers. Only more silence. But the walls of Riverside were speaking now, even after demolition. And with every shoe, every note, every scratched plea, the truth pressed harder against the town. Someone had built a prison, someone had locked the door, and someone, somewhere, still carried the knowledge of what really happened to the children and their teachers. By the start of 2007, the Riverside case had transformed from a cold file to a storm of national outrage. Each week another clue surfaced. Each week the town was reminded how close rescue had been and how thoroughly it had failed. The "Help Us" message carved into the concrete wall hit like a blade. Families replayed those words in their minds until they bled. The children were alive, begging, while search dogs patted the floors above. The FBI doubled their excavation, determined to leave nothing buried. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted, every nail bagged. Teams mapped the chambers in 3 dimensions, overlaying them against 1960s blueprints. What they discovered confirmed long-held suspicions. Thomas Heller, the old custodian, had altered Riverside extensively in the years before it closed. Blueprints showed a simple boiler room. Reality revealed a maze of false walls and sealed corridors, the kind only someone obsessed with secrecy would build. Among the debris, investigators found boxes of canned goods dating from the 1970s. Some were opened, their contents long spoiled. Others remained sealed. Why store food in hidden chambers beneath a school? Civil defense drills had been common in the Cold War, but the stockpiles suggested something more personal. Heller hadn't just built storage, he'd built containment. A chilling picture emerged. After Riverside closed in 1969, Heller had continued, tinkering, carving out his underground warren. When he died in 1982, his son Mark inherited not just the property access, but also his father's obsession. Locals remembered seeing Mark carrying lumber and cement toward the building, even though it was supposedly abandoned. A neighbor recalled him muttering once, "Dad said this place keeps people safe." At the time, it had sounded eccentric. In retrospect, it sounded like a mantra. FBI profilers began piecing together a psychological portrait. Mark Heller had grown up in the shadow of a controlling father, immersed in paranoia about nuclear war, outsiders, keeping the town safe. When his father died, Mark was left with unfinished constructions and twisted logic. By 1987, when the St. Mary's group approached Riverside for their history lesson, he was 25, unmoored, solitary, and deeply familiar with the building's hidden bones. The working theory was brutal in its simplicity. Mark intercepted the group inside Riverside, guided them, or forced them, into the chamber and sealed them in. Whether he believed he was protecting them or whether control itself was the point remained unclear. The note found in adult handwriting, "They will stay until it is safe again," now looked less cryptic, more like justification. Safe from what? Perhaps from a world only Mark's fractured mind believed was dangerous. But proof was still needed. Mark denied it all, insisting he had no role. "I never touched those kids," he told agents. "You want someone to blame? You blame my father." Yet his alibi cracked under scrutiny. Employment records showed gaps in spring 1987. One old co-worker remembered Mark missing for days, returning quiet and pale. Another recalled him snapping when someone joked about Riverside, snarling, "You don't know what that place is for." Forensic evidence tightened the noose. DNA from the male hair in the second chamber was compared against a voluntary swab. Mark gave under pressure. It wasn't a perfect match. The degradation over 19 years blurred the profile, but it was consistent. Statistically, it pointed squarely to him. Still, families wanted more than science. They wanted a story they could hold, however horrific. That came from an unexpected quarter. An old acquaintance of Mark's, a woman named Elaine Parker, came forward after seeing his name in the papers. In 1988, she had briefly dated him. She remembered visiting his home once, a sagging house filled with tools and boxes of notebooks. In one notebook, she recalled, were lists of names, not children's names, but categories: food, water, occupants, tasks. Mark had mumbled that he was keeping Dad's system alive. Elaine had left him soon after, unsettled by his intensity. But one detail made investigators freeze. She said he always carried a heavy key ring, jangling like shackles, and once mentioned doors no one else can open. The FBI searched his old property, now a rental. In the attic, they found a box of his father's belongings, including journals. Pages were filled with warnings about nuclear annihilation, about safe rooms, and chosen survivors. In one margin, a line, "Mark will keep them safe if I cannot." The pieces were falling together with cruel clarity. Yet even as the case built against Mark Heller, one question gnawed at families. How long had the children survived? The notebooks, the shoes, the "help us" scrawl suggested at least days. But did they linger longer, waiting for a door that never opened? A breakthrough came when lab technicians analyzed soot on the chamber ceiling. It wasn't natural. It was from candle smoke. Tests dated it to late May 1987, nearly 2 weeks after the disappearance. Families broke again when told. Their children had endured nearly 2 weeks underground. They had sung, prayed, written, pleaded, and nobody had heard them. For the town, the revelation tore open old wounds wider than ever. Vigils turned to marches. Protesters held signs outside the courthouse. They were alive. You failed them. Some demanded charges against Sheriff Minton, now retired in Florida, for negligence. Others shouted for federal accountability, accusing the FBI of missing the falsing wall in 1987. Officials muttered about limitations of the era, but no excuse could blunt the reality. 11 lives had been there for the saving, and instead they had been left. In March 2007, Mark Heller was indicted for 11 counts of kidnapping and homicide. His trial would take years to wind through the courts, but the families didn't wait. They gathered outside the courthouse, holding the shoeboxes of evidence, shoes, ribbons, notebooks, and chanted their children's names. For them, the trial was secondary. What mattered was that the silence had been broken. Still, questions lingered like smoke. Why hadn't Mark made demands? Why keep them, feed them, only to let them die? Some psychiatrists suggested he had been reenacting his father's civil defense drills, treating the children as occupants in a twisted experiment. Others believed it was simpler. Power. The ability to decide who was safe and who was not. The families didn't care about motives anymore. They cared about voices. And in April, as excavation wrapped, one final discovery gave them a fragment of what they sought. Buried under a collapsed shelf was a cassette recorder, rusted but intact enough for labs to recover fragments of audio. The tape hissed, warped by damp, but voices were audible. Children's voices, singing softly, an old hymn, broken and trembling. At the end, Miss Ellison's voice, calm but worn, whispering, "Stay together, someone will come." No one did. But 19 years later, the recorder gave the parents something to hold. Proof their children had clung to each other. Proof their teachers had tried to keep them calm. Proof they had not died forgotten. When the families heard the tape at a private session, many collapsed into sobs. Others gripped each other's hands. Anna Porter's mother whispered, "I can hear her." For the first time in 19 years, she closed her eyes and felt something other than the cold. The case, in its brutal completeness, was almost ready to close. But one more chapter remained. The trial would come. The truth would be spoken in open court. And Mill Creek would finally hear, in stark daylight, the full shape of the crime that had haunted it since 1987. The trial of Mark Heller began in the fall of 2009. By then, Mill Creek was a hollowed town, its mill shuttered, its streets lined with boarded shops. But for weeks the courthouse swelled with life. Reporters, relatives, curious onlookers. Families who had waited 22 years filled the front benches, clutching worn photographs. The edges frayed from decades of handling. The prosecution's case was stark. They showed jurors the evidence cataloged from the hidden chambers, the shoes, the notebooks, the scrawled, "Help us 516, the Polaroid. They displayed Thomas Heller's journals, pages ranting about keeping them safe, and drills that must continue. They called Elaine Parker, the old girlfriend, who testified to Mark's obsession with Dad's system and his jangling keys. Forensic experts spoke about DNA, how the degraded hair matched Mark's profile, how candle soot proved the children survived days underground. A chemist explained how the jars showed fingerprints of an adult man, not of the children, and how rope fibers matched spools found in Mark's shed. Then came the cassette. The prosecution played only 30 seconds, enough to show jurors the sound of young voices singing, the faint sob of a child, and Miss Ellison's tired whisper, "Stay together. Someone will come." In the gallery, parents wept openly. The jury sat stricken. Even the judge closed his eyes. The defense argued that Mark had been scapegoated for his father's crimes. They claimed the DNA was inconclusive, the journals the ravings of a dead man. They suggested the chambers could have been occupied by others, that Mark's only fault was proximity. "You are condemning a man for being his father's son," the attorney said. But when Mark himself took the stand, the illusion cracked. He was gaunt, his hands trembling. Asked where he was on May 14, 1987, he said he couldn't remember. Asked why his DNA was in the chamber, he said softly, "I built repairs there once. I didn't hurt them." Asked what his father's journals meant, he muttered. "Dad said people had to stay put, to be safe. He said I had to carry on. I didn't mean..." His words broke into incoherence. To the families, it was enough. They didn't hear denial. They heard a man still bound to his father's madness, still clinging to the warped creed that had stolen their children. After 6 weeks, the jury deliberated less than 2 days. The verdict: guilty on all counts, kidnapping and homicide, 11 lives stolen. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. When the sentence was read, gasps and sobs filled the courtroom. Parents clutched each other's hands, not in joy, but in exhaustion. Justice, some called it. But for the families, it was more complicated. No verdict could return the years, the laughter, the futures erased. Still, for the first time in 2 decades, their children's story had been told aloud in daylight, not hidden in silence. After the trial, the town raised funds for a memorial on the site of Riverside. A granite monument was placed where the school once stood. Etched into stone were 11 names: Michael Collins, Peter Walsh, Jacob Reed, Emily Reed, Anna Porter, Brian Harris, Laura Miller, Samuel Briggs, Catherine Lawson, Miss Ruth Ellison, Mrs. Dorothy. Beneath the names, in simple lettering, "We were here." The phrase came from the desk discovered in the chamber, scratched by small hands. It became both a marker of suffering and of defiance, proof that they had existed, loved, and endured together, even in the dark. On the day of the unveiling, hundreds gathered. Some carried flowers, some photos, some only their presence. Anna's mother laid her daughter's warped notebook at the base. Laura Miller's father, after years of rage, stood silent with tears finally loosening. Samuel Briggs' brother touched the stone and whispered, "You're not forgotten." Reporters asked Sheriff Rowe what he thought of the verdict. He said, "It will never be enough. But at least now the silence belongs to them, not to the man who caused it." As for Mark Heller, he was transferred to a maximum security prison. He gave no interviews. Guards said he spent his days scribbling in notebooks, muttering about drills, sometimes rocking and whispering. It wasn't safe yet. For Mill Creek, healing was slow. Some families moved away, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to keep the children's names alive in the town that had failed them once. Each May 14th, candles lined the memorial, their flames flickering in the Ohio wind. And though the school was gone, locals swore the land itself still spoke. Teenagers passing the fence at night claimed they heard faint echoes of singing. Adults dismissed it as imagination. But for the families, the thought was comforting. If their children's voices lingered, it was not in fear anymore, but in remembrance. In her final years, Anna Porter's mother would tell visitors the same thing, gazing at the stone monument. They weren't lost. They weren't forgotten. They were here. And now, so is the truth. For 19 years, the walls of Riverside held their secret. For 19 years, the town staggered under silence. But when the basement gave way, the truth came crawling out. Not a curse, not a mystery, but a crime, human, deliberate, and cruel. The kind of crime that leaves scars not just on families, but on generations, and yet, in the simple words carved by small hands, we were here. The Ridge 11 left behind not just tragedy, but testimony. A voice louder than the silence.